How avoidants treat the one they truly love versus the placeholder is one of those conversations that makes people deeply uncomfortable. Because somewhere deep down, almost everyone who has loved an avoidant has wondered the same haunting question at least once. Did they actually love me, or was I just there? And the painful part is that avoidants rarely give obvious answers. Sometimes they stay for years with someone they barely feel emotionally connected to, while running away from the person who actually touched them deeply. Sometimes they look calmer with the placeholder, and more emotionally unstable with the person they truly love. And if you do not understand avoidant psychology, this dynamic can completely destroy your sense of reality. Because logically, people assume love should create closeness, consistency, reassurance, effort. But avoidants often experience love in reverse. The deeper the emotional attachment becomes, the more fear enters the relationship alongside it. Suddenly, intimacy stops feeling comforting and starts feeling dangerous. And that is why the person they truly love often experiences confusion, mixed signals, emotional withdrawal, and intense emotional contradictions, while the placeholder may experience a version of the avoidant that feels calmer, simpler, and emotionally easier to manage. In this video, we are going to unpack the emotional difference between these two dynamics, because understanding this can completely change how you interpret avoidant behavior forever. And if you have ever spent nights overanalyzing an avoidant's actions trying to figure out whether you actually mattered to them emotionally, subscribe to the channel right now, because this channel is basically where emotionally confused people finally start seeing the hidden patterns nobody else explains properly. One of the hardest truths to accept about avoidance is that many of them enter relationships emotionally unclear from the very beginning. Not always intentionally, not always maliciously. But avoidants are often disconnected from their own emotional depth until attachment becomes impossible to ignore. In the early stages, they may genuinely enjoy someone's presence, affection, validation, companionship, physical connection, or emotional attention without actually knowing whether the relationship has deep emotional roots. And because avoidants are so skilled at functioning emotionally on the surface level, they can stay inside emotionally incomplete relationships far longer than most people realize. Sometimes what looks like love is actually comfort, familiarity, loneliness relief, validation, emotional convenience. The relationship exists because it does not emotionally challenge them too deeply. And this is where placeholders often enter the picture. A placeholder is not necessarily someone the avoidant dislikes or disrespects. In many cases, the avoidant genuinely cares about them. But the emotional intensity never fully breaks through their deeper defenses. The relationship stays manageable, predictable, emotionally controlled. There is affection without emotional exposure, closeness without terrifying vulnerability. And because the avoidant never feels fully emotionally consumed by the relationship, they can often appear more stable in these dynamics, less reactive, less fearful, less emotionally conflicted, which becomes incredibly confusing for the person who later experiences the avoidant's deeper attachment patterns and wonders why they are suddenly receiving such a different version. Because here is the paradox most people do not understand. The placeholder often gets the more emotionally relaxed version of the avoidant, not because they are loved more deeply, but because there is less emotional risk involved. Avoidants become the most internally activated when they genuinely fear emotional dependency, rejection, or loss. So in relationships where the emotional stakes remain lower, the avoidance nervous system stays calmer. They do not feel as threatened. They are less likely to panic after intimacy, less likely to disappear emotionally after moments of closeness, less likely to spiral internally over vulnerability. And from the outside, this can create the illusion that the placeholder relationship is healthier or more emotionally secure. The avoidant may communicate more steadily, stay longer, act more predictable. They may even appear more committed on the surface. Meanwhile, the person the avoidant truly loves often experiences emotional whiplash instead, deep moments of connection followed by distance, vulnerability followed by withdrawal, intense closeness followed by emotional shutdowns that seem to come out of nowhere. And this dynamic becomes incredibly painful because the person receiving those mixed signals naturally assumes they are the problem. They think, if they really loved me, wouldn't they treat me better? Wouldn't love make them more consistent instead of less? But avoidant attachment rarely works that way. Real emotional attachment activates fear inside avoidance in ways placeholders simply do not. And that fear changes their behavior dramatically. Because when avoidants truly fall in love, they often stop feeling emotionally in control of themselves. And that loss of control terrifies them more than most people realize. Avoidants spend years building emotional walls designed to protect them from vulnerability. dependency, disappointment, and emotional engulfment. They survive relationships by maintaining distance emotionally even when they care deeply. But genuine love threatens all of those protective systems at once. Suddenly they care too much, suddenly your opinion matters too much, your absence affects them too deeply, your rejection feels catastrophic, your emotional needs begin activating fears they cannot easily regulate anymore. And instead of moving closer when this happens, avoidants often instinctively create distance because distance helps them regain emotional control internally. This is why the one they truly love often feels the avoidant pulling away right after moments of deep connection, right after intimacy, right after vulnerability, right after emotional closeness finally starts feeling real. To the other person it feels cruel and confusing, but internally the avoidant is usually overwhelmed by the intensity of their own attachment. Real love forces them to confront emotions they spent their entire lives suppressing: fear of abandonment, fear of inadequacy, fear of losing independence, fear of emotional dependency, fear of eventually being hurt. And many avoidants simply do not know how to stay emotionally present while carrying all of those fears at the same time. That is why placeholder relationships often feel emotionally safer to avoidants even when they lack depth, because placeholders allow avoidants to stay inside relationships without fully confronting vulnerability. The emotional intimacy remains limited enough that the avoidant can still maintain psychological distance comfortably. There is less fear of emotional engulfment, less fear of devastating heartbreak, less fear of losing themselves inside another person emotionally. And as strange as it sounds, avoidants can sometimes remain in emotionally shallow relationships for years precisely because the relationship never forces them to emotionally evolve. It never breaks through their deeper defenses strongly enough to trigger panic. Everything stays emotionally manageable, but the person they truly love changes that entirely. Real love destabilizes avoidance emotionally because it bypasses the emotional control systems they rely on for safety. Suddenly, the relationship matters too much to stay emotionally neutral. And that creates enormous internal conflict. One part of the avoidant desperately wants closeness, connection, intimacy, emotional safety. Another part feels overwhelmed by how vulnerable real attachment makes them feel, so they move toward love and away from it at the same time. They crave intimacy while fearing it. They want connection while resisting emotional dependence, and the person on the receiving end often becomes trapped trying to understand behavior that feels painfully contradictory. Because the avoidant may genuinely love them deeply while simultaneously behaving in ways that feel emotionally distancing, confusing, or even self-sabotaging. And that contradiction is exactly what makes loving an avoidant feel so emotionally exhausting for so many people. And this is why avoidants often pull away the hardest from the person they truly love, not because the connection is weak, but because it is emotionally overpowering in ways they do not know how to regulate. Most people assume emotional distance means emotional indifference, but with avoidance, distance is often a coping mechanism for emotional intensity. The more emotionally significant the relationship becomes, the more their nervous system starts interpreting intimacy as a threat to their independence, stability, and emotional control. So right when the relationship starts becoming deeper, safer, more vulnerable, the avoidant may suddenly become harder to reach emotionally. They may need more space, more isolation, more distractions. And to the person on the receiving end, this feels devastating because it creates a painful contradiction. The avoidant just shared something vulnerable. They just created a moment of closeness. They just acted loving, affectionate, emotionally present, and now suddenly they are distant again, cold again, detached again. But internally, many avoidants are not withdrawing because they stopped caring. They are withdrawing because they care too much and do not know how to exist peacefully inside that level of emotional exposure. Real love creates emotional dependency risks they spent years protecting themselves from, and that is why the person they truly love often experiences emotional confusion far more intensely than the placeholder ever does. The placeholder relationship rarely activates the avoidant's deepest fears strongly enough to create this constant internal push and pull. But real attachment shakes the entire emotional structure they built their identity around. This is also why placeholders rarely get to see the avoidant's deepest emotional layers. The relationship simply does not penetrate far enough emotionally to expose them. So placeholders may describe the avoidant as emotionally detached but stable, calm but distant, affectionate but somewhat surface level. They may never witness the avoidant spiraling internally after vulnerability, They may never experience the intense emotional contradictions that emerge when an avoidant becomes deeply attached, but the person the avoidant truly loves often sees flashes of emotions the avoidant barely shows anyone else: unexpected jealousy, sudden emotional tenderness, deep conversations at strange hours, moments where the avoidant's emotional walls briefly collapse and something painfully vulnerable slips through before they quickly shut it down again. Sometimes the avoidant becomes possessive in subtle ways they cannot explain logically. Sometimes they become emotionally reactive in ways that even confuse themselves, because unlike placeholder relationships, real love activates emotional depth avoidants usually keep buried under layers of self-protection. And the heartbreaking part is that these moments are often inconsistent. The person they truly love gets glimpses of incredible emotional depth, but rarely stable access to it. One moment the avoidant feels deeply emotionally connected, almost overwhelmed by closeness. The next moment, fear takes over and they retreat emotionally to regain control again. That inconsistency becomes emotionally addictive for many people because the emotional highs feel incredibly intimate, meaningful, and rare, but the emotional withdrawals afterward create confusion intense enough to make someone question their entire worth. Because when avoidants genuinely fall in love, they often feel emotionally out of control in a way that deeply unsettles them. Avoidants survive by maintaining internal distance from overwhelming emotions. They value self-sufficiency, emotional autonomy, and psychological control because those things make them feel safe. But real love threatens all of that. Suddenly, another person has emotional influence over them in ways they cannot fully manage anymore. Your mood affects them. Your absence affects them. Your attention matters more than they want it to. And for many avoidants, that level of emotional influence feels terrifying because it creates vulnerability they cannot emotionally compartmentalize. They may start overthinking conversations, feeling emotionally preoccupied without wanting to admit it, becoming hyper-aware of changes in the relationship, feeling jealousy they try to suppress, wanting reassurance while simultaneously resisting the urge to ask for it. And this internal conflict creates enormous emotional tension because avoidants are often deeply uncomfortable needing anyone emotionally. They associate emotional dependency with weakness, loss of control, or eventual pain. So instead of leaning fully into the relationship, they often try to regain emotional balance through distance, through distraction, through emotional shutdowns, through convincing themselves they need less than they actually do, but the feelings remain underneath all of it. Quiet, unresolved, pressurized, and the person they truly love becomes emotionally unforgettable precisely because they activated emotions the avoidant can no longer fully escape from. That is why the one they truly love often receives the strongest mixed signals. The relationship becomes a battlefield between attachment and fear happening inside the avoidant simultaneously. One day the avoidant seems fully emotionally present, deeply invested, vulnerable, affectionate, even future-oriented. The connection feels real, undeniable, emotionally intimate in a way that leaves the other person feeling deeply seen. And then suddenly something shifts. The avoidant becomes distant, slower to respond, emotionally harder to reach. They may seem numb, overwhelmed, detached, or irritated without clear explanation, and the person experiencing this naturally starts trying harder to restore the closeness that just existed days earlier. But this usually intensifies the avoidant's internal panic because now the relationship feels emotionally demanding on top of emotionally vulnerable. The more emotionally real the connection becomes, the harder it often becomes for avoidants to regulate intimacy consistently. That is why people who date avoidants frequently feel trapped inside emotional whiplash. The closeness feels too real to walk away from easily, but the inconsistency slowly destroys emotional security. And what makes this even more painful is that the avoidant themselves may genuinely not understand why they behave this way. They may truly love the person while simultaneously feeling suffocated by the emotional intensity love creates inside them. That contradiction is what makes avoidant relationships feel so emotionally exhausting and intoxicating at the same time, because every moment of connection feels emotionally meaningful precisely because it is so difficult to sustain consistently. Meanwhile, placeholder relationships can last far longer than people expect precisely because they never force the avoidant to confront these deeper emotional conflicts. The relationship remains emotionally manageable enough to avoid triggering full vulnerability panic. There may be companionship, affection, routine, comfort, attraction, shared history, even loyalty, but not the level of emotional exposure that destabilizes the avoidant internally. And from the outside, these relationships can look surprisingly functional: stable routines, predictable communication, less emotional turbulence, but underneath that stability there is often emotional flatness. The avoidant remains partially emotionally detached even after years together. The relationship exists within emotional limits that protect the avoidant from fully confronting intimacy, and this is why some avoidants stay in placeholder relationships for years while sabotaging relationships with people they genuinely love deeply. The placeholder relationship feels safer because it does not threaten their emotional defenses in the same way. There is less fear of devastating heartbreak because there is less emotional surrender happening internally. But the person they truly love becomes emotionally dangerous to them because that connection reaches places inside them they spent years avoiding. And sadly, many avoidants would rather maintain emotional control inside an emotionally safer relationship than risk fully falling into vulnerability with someone who truly reaches their heart. And yet, despite how emotionally detached avoidants may appear on the surface, there is usually a massive difference in how mentally and emotionally preoccupied they become with the person they truly love compared to a placeholder. The placeholder may receive consistency, routine, even long-term presence, but the avoidant's inner world often remains relatively calm, predictable, emotionally controlled, but real love creates emotional curiosity that avoidants struggle to shut off completely. Even when they pull away physically or emotionally, the person they truly love tends to stay in their mind constantly. They wonder what you are feeling even while pretending not to care. They replay conversations long after they end. Small changes in your energy affect them more deeply than they want to admit. Your distance unsettles them, your silence becomes louder than they expected, they become hyper-aware of your presence without understanding why it feels so emotionally consuming. And this is one of the most confusing things about avoidance. The people they love the deepest often believe they mattered the least because avoidants hide emotional impact instead of expressing it openly. The avoidant may look calmer around placeholders precisely because the emotional investment is shallower, but with real love, their nervous system becomes activated in ways they cannot fully control. Suddenly, they are emotionally reactive to things they normally dismiss easily. They may quietly monitor whether you are pulling away. They may feel jealousy they refuse to admit out loud. They may become emotionally thrown off by the idea of losing you while simultaneously resisting deeper intimacy with you. And all of this creates an exhausting emotional contradiction where the avoidant feels deeply attached internally while appearing emotionally inconsistent externally. This is also why placeholders sometimes appear to get treated better on the surface, and this reality breaks a lot of people emotionally when they first recognize it, because many people assume consistency automatically means deeper love. But with avoidance, consistency can sometimes mean emotional safety rather than emotional depth. The placeholder relationship does not activate the avoidant's deepest fears, so the avoidant has less reason to pull away defensively. Less emotional panic, less vulnerability hangovers, less internal chaos, and because of that, the relationship may appear healthier from the outside. The avoidant may communicate more steadily, stay emotionally calmer, and behave more predictably overall. Meanwhile, the person they truly love receives emotional intensity mixed with withdrawal, closeness mixed with fear, affection mixed with emotional shutdowns, and naturally this creates devastating self-doubt. The person experiencing those mixed signals often starts wondering why the avoidant could seemingly treat someone else with more stability and care, but the truth is often far more psychologically complicated. The placeholder relationship feels emotionally manageable because the avoidant never fully surrenders emotionally inside it. Their deeper fears stay dormant, their emotional wounds stay protected, but real love forces avoidance into emotional territory they do not know how to navigate safely. Suddenly they feel vulnerable, dependent, emotionally exposed, and terrified of losing control.